We are continuing our studies of the teachings of Hazrat Pir Murshid Inayat Khan, and we have reached in our studies of the 10 Sufi thoughts, we have reached the 10th thought. And the 10th thought is this: there is one path, the annihilation of the false ego in the real, which raises the mortal to immortality, and in which resides all perfection. One path, annihilation in the real, which raises the mortal to immortality. An old Sufi saying goes, there are as many paths to God as there are breaths of created creatures. As many paths to God as there are breaths. Many paths. As many as there are creatures. So many different routes to God. And yet, at the same time, there really is only one path to God. Is that because only one of the many paths is correct and the others are incorrect? No. It is because all of the paths that lead to God, all of the paths that reach the conclusion, have this in common: that they involve the dissolution of the separate self. Now, the separate self is a phenomenon of this world. It has resulted from historical and biological and psychological processes, and it is ephemeral. It isn't permanent. If one considers the longue durée of the life of the universe, our little ego, how brief it is. It emerges out of all of the preceding history of the world. It flashes out, and yet it is not to last. Death comes. Death comes to the body. Death comes to the mind. We'll be remembered. Our human identity will be remembered for a number of years, perhaps after our life. But eventually it will be forgotten. This earth will crumble to dust. Right now, this ego seems the most real of realities. We organize the whole universe around it. It's at the center of everything. This identity of mine and its desires. And yet, in the grand scope of things, how temporary it is, how transitory it is. It isn't permanent. And sooner or later, it will be relinquished. But the path to God involves not relinquishing one's little identity accidentally as a result of mortality, but intentionally giving it up, offering it up, dissolving it, opening its boundaries, letting the light in. And thereby, while we're still living on earth, while we still have these human bodies and these human minds, come to know life beyond the narrow boundary of our selfish self. Whichever path one pursues, This is the gist of the path, to become transparent, to dissolve in one's egotism, to let the light in, to become emptier and emptier. Carl Jung said that the first part of life is concerned with the creation of the self, developing it, having an identity in the world, having a place in society, individuating. Whereas the second half of life has another task: dismantling what has been created, taking it apart again, going within. Now this dismantling, this dissolution, is known in Sufism by the word fana, which is rendered in this thought as annihilation. Now, annihilation is perhaps not a welcome word to the ego. If anything, the ego wants to secure its longevity and reinforce its boundaries. And yet, in the depths of the ego is the memory of something vast or something more whole. And this brokenness, the brokenness of a worldview that divides the world between self and other, within and without, this brokenness cannot last forever. Already it's fraying, already coming apart. It would be unthinkably exhausting for the ego to endlessly defend itself and reinforce itself. Sooner or later, naturally, the ego must ripen, must mature, must evolve, must, in the course of its study of life, must come to a higher understanding, must unclench the fist around the heart and breathe well. And with that comes ease, with that comes far-seeing, with that comes the taking apart of this structure, this device, which has as its purpose self-defense. And yes, biologically, we need to ensure that we have food to eat and water to drink and shelter. But that biological drive to survive tends in the mind to become narrower and at the same time more and more all-consuming, as an egoic imperative to dominate, to triumph, to have one's way in everything, to be right while all others are wrong. This pernicious selfishness, which becomes so part of our nature that it's invisible. One doesn't see one's bias. One doesn't see that constant one-upmanship and presumption that characterizes the selfish ego, the nafs al-amara. But when one begins to feel its hard edges, when, as it were, one's elbows begin to hurt, one feels the limitation of the space one occupies and feels frustrations piling up, then the soul's call to freedom might become palpable. One might feel it hasn't always been this way. It need not always be this way. There's another way of life. One wants to breathe freely. And so one goes out into nature, one goes within in silence, one speaks less, one contemplates the beautiful, the sacred. One follows a path of service, and still the dark fires of the ego flare up, and one has to grapple with them. But that grappling is what is called the path of fana, the path of the pursuit of selflessness. And more one might experience the hal, the state of fana. It could come over you suddenly, a state of awe, of surrender. It might happen when listening to exquisite music. It might happen out in the wilderness. It might happen coming face to face with a sudden change in the world around you, like a death or a celebration, something that sunders the monotony of the routine course of one's life and makes you feel raw, makes you feel awake, shattered in your complacency, and suddenly keenly alert to the intimacy of this moment, as if the skin was peeled back. That sensation that shatters your assumptions, makes you question who you have taken yourself to be, so that in a moment you taste lethe, you taste oblivion, you taste what it means to have no name, what it means to have no form. That's a hal, that's a state of fana, a state of annihilation. And you might find then the state passes. The next morning comes, you go back to work, some of the old resentments rise up, you're grumbling again. It was just a state. It came and it's gone, and you're back to the substance, the ingrained substance of your ego. And you still have to churn the contents of your mind and heart and sort through all of the byproducts of your life. They're not yet dissolved because it was only a state. But there's also a station of fana. And that's the work of the path, is to more and more approach the station of fana, where it isn't just that a state came over you, you had a transcendental experience, you had a momentary peak moment, and then you return to your old egoic life. No, the path means that one's very mind is undergoing a reorganization, a relaxation. And this is only possible by continuous practice, day by day, keeping up your meditation, keeping up moral culture in your daily life, because that's how fana works. If you're always pursuing your own ends selfishly, how is that great unwinding of the selfish self going to take place? The unwinding takes place through sympathy, respect, consideration, meeting each person in friendliness, so that more and more there isn't a hard line between self and other. You see yourself in the other, and the other is in yourself. And you see there's a great self in all selves. And we're all just the extensions, the instruments of that one life. That's the station of fana. in which that isn't a concept, it isn't the intellectual notion that there is a God of whom all souls are vehicles, but the very living experience of being a vehicle for the divine life. That's fana. And fana leads into baqa. Baqa means reinstatement, subsistence, resurrection. So fana is like the out-breath. Fana is letting go. Fana is forgetting yourself, losing your identity. After that identity has developed in the course of your life and become calcified and hardened and rigid, alchemically there's a dissolution, solve. And in alchemy, that's the first work. It's called the minor work, the work of dissolution. The second operation is coagulate, crystallization. But that crystallization is only possible after the dissolution. Another way to understand it is that we're in a dream. All of us are dreaming without knowing it. A hadith of the Prophet says, life is a dream, and when you die, you awaken. So we're all dreaming. Just as in the night, you might dream and not know that you're dreaming. And the dream might be enjoyable or frightening, but you don't realize your body is lying in bed. You're dreaming. You wake up, if you had a frightening dream, you're very relieved to wake up because you realize it was all in your mind. Well, in some very real sense, that is so here and now. We are all in the midst of a dream. The soul transcends the dream, but the mind is in the dream. So what is fana? Fana means waking up, not waiting till death to wake from the dream, but here in this world, waking up. That means the dream dissolves, the dream disappears. You don't see what's in front of you anymore. You see the heavens, you see the expanse of vibration and illumination that fills the Empyrean. You are in a state of intimacy with pure spirits and in the presence of God, woken from the dream. And this egoic life defined by the transitory lineaments of your physical body and your earthly ambitions, that seems something now very distant. You're in the space of transcendental revelation. That's fana. But then follows baqa. Baqa means returning to the dream. Return to your mind. Return to your relationships and all of the duties of life. But now, with the knowledge of the transcendental state, with the knowledge of the soul. So it isn't that the soul is something far away, conjectured. The soul is the center of your life, and God is the center of the soul. And this mind and this body are the instrument of the life of the soul. You're awake in the dream. You know it's a dream. You know that it's transitory. You know that there is more to reality than this. But you occupy this dreamscape consciously, purposefully, and fulfill your work here. That is fana. So this is the 10th of the Sufi thoughts, the 10 Sufi thoughts of Hazrat Pir Murshid Inayat Khan. There is one path, the annihilation of the false ego in the real, which raises the mortal to immortality and in which resides all perfection.